Well, welcome to this episode of our QC Conversations. If you're brand new to our channel, we are all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. And in this episode, we're going to be picking up on the theme of doubt and deconstruction, why some people lose their faith while in the process of asking questions, other people are strengthened in it, and what do the apostles and their fates ultimately have to do with the credibility of the Jesus story. And my guest today is Dr. Sean McDowell. Sean has earned MA degrees in both philosophy and theology at the Talbot School of Theology at Biola, where he now teaches on faculty there. He also earned his PhD at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary on what we can know historically about the fate of the apostles. I first became aware of Sean through reading a series of books that he's written. Most recently, he's just put out this, Set Adrift, which will be sort of the theme of today's episode. And on his YouTube channel, not only does he have a ton of helpful content, but he hosts some of the best discussions that I've seen with people who have either got different convictions or have walked away from their faith as well. And so with no further ado, it's my honor to be able to introduce onto the channel, Dr. Sean McDowell. Hey, Sean.
Dan, thanks for such a great introduction. It's an honor to be with you.
I appreciate you jumping on from a different time zone all the way over in the US. And at the time of this recording, it's nearly Christmas. We're a couple of days away. So Merry Christmas to you, mate.
Well, likewise to you.
Sean, your dad, Josh McDowell, is something of a household name in the at least English-speaking evangelical world because he wrote books many decades ago now called More Than a Carpenter and Evidence That Demands a Verdict that have sold in the millions and kind of launched a whole new wave of apologetics. But for those of our audience who maybe haven't come across you personally, do you want to just take a couple of minutes to maybe spell out your story?
Yeah, so I grew up in the home of one of the most influential and well-known apologists probably over the past half century. You're right, his writing and speaking was really done before people like William Lane Craig or J.P. Moreland or any of these popular apologists are really kind of a decade younger than he is. So he was really a trailblazer in that world.
Yeah.
And he's still doing it in his own way. He's 84, but he still loves what he does and is, making contributions as he can. Grew up in that home and Christianity made sense to me. I think the time where I really started to own my faith is in the 90s, mid 90s. I'm in college and we first get this crazy new thing called the internet. And I'm searching around and I learned that a lot of the atheist secular web began taking some of my dad's material chapter by chapter and responding to his book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Now, before that time, I really had not met smart, thoughtful people challenging the things that I heard my father argue and defend. There were lawyers and doctors and historians and professors arguing against this stuff. And it was really unsettling to me. For the first time, I thought, wow, I might actually be wrong about this. Well, to make a long story short, I was actually at Biola during this time. And again, people like J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig were becoming associated with Biola, and I started reading their works, and I go to JP's office hours and really began to realize, okay, this is true. This really makes sense to me. But I went and had a conversation with my dad in Breckenridge, Colorado, up in the mountains in just beautiful Colorado ski town. And I said something effective, Dad, I want to know what's true, but I'm not sure that I'm convinced Christianity is true, not knowing how this influential apologist would respond. And he didn't miss a beat, Dan. He looks at me and goes, son, I think that's great. And I remember thinking, did you hear what I just said? And he goes, look, you can't live on my convictions. You've got to follow what you think is true. And if you seek after Jesus, I'm confident you'll keep following after him because he is the truth. And, your mom and I love you no matter what. And I tell that story. I don't want to over dramatize it, but that was a very significant moment for me going, okay, I got to know what I think is true. I've got to figure this out and really build my own convictions. And I have a very similar ministry to my father. He works with Cru, formerly Campus Crusade for Christ. So he's first an evangelist. I teach full-time at Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. I'm a professor, discipler first, who also does evangelism. But we overlap with apologetics, culture. We both talk about a lot of issues related to sexuality.
And you were involved in updating your dad's book more recently. I mean, it's decades old now in its original form, but you put out new evidence that demands a verdict and a whole range of different contributors for the various chapters. What sort of change do you think in the landscape of faith and maybe the state of apologetics that warranted that update?
Well, it was interesting. Doing that update, I had a chance to talk to my dad because when that came out in 2017, it had been 45 years since it was first published.
Yeah,
And
wow.
so he had this unique perspective of seeing the world of apologetics literally transform that few people have been able to see. So a lot of this reflection comes from just talking with him. I would say a few things. Number one, the issues have gotten younger and younger. So when he started speaking on college campuses, life change was really taking place in the university. In the 90s, he noticed it shift to high school. And then in the 2000s, even into like junior high, and now in some cases, even younger than it was before. And some of this is brought on by technology, but those life decisions are happening way younger than they did years ago. Second, we've seen a radical shift in just mental health issues. And this affects how people process things like truth. A friend of mine, Mark Matlock, says one of the reasons people find relativism so appealing is not logically, but broken families, broken communities makes it harder for people to grasp an objective truth that is good and noble that I should conform my life to.
Mm.
I think that's a piece of it. But probably the largest shift is just from kind of a sense of objectivity to subjectivity. So when I would talk with my dad, he'd talk about starting to speak on college campuses, really late 60s, early 70s into the 80s. And there was a sense that there was such a thing as truth. We can know it. We should find it. So when he would speak, you'd hear challenges like, give me proof, show me the evidence. Truth mattered. But now there's been this shift from truth, something you discover, to the word of the year now, at least the Merriam-Webster word of the year 2 weeks ago is authentic, which means, in a sense, being true to yourself. If I feel it, if I decide it, then that's the right course of action for me. So rather than looking outside of myself for truth, I look within with my own feelings and my instincts, and everything in culture says, live your truth, you be you. So I think
Mm.
those are three of the big ways, the larger shift. And maybe this would be helpful. There's certain timeless truths we need to defend, and then there's timely truths. Evidence that demands verdict deals with the timeless truths that people have always asked. Questions like, is Jesus God? Did Jesus rise from the grave? Is the Bible true? The timely questions have shifted to issues like race, people have been dealing with recently, at least in my country, issues like critical theory, issues like the LGBTQ revolution. Those are timely kinds of issues.
Mm. And you did your academic work kind of on more of those timeless issues in terms of exploring the whole idea of the fate of the apostles. And I think it's a common experience that people maybe growing up in church would have heard preached that all of the apostles, except maybe the apostle John, these first eyewitnesses to Jesus's ministry, the people who claimed to have seen him alive after he supposedly resurrected from the dead, that all of them were willing to die for those claims and were martyred in some pretty extreme ways. I even remember walking through this gorgeous sort of cathedral building in Rome, the Laterno, St. John's cathedral there in Laterno, and they have these big 12 columns where at the base of each one of these columns, it's got carved out of the marble the 12 apostles holding the means of their martyrdom. So
Yeah.
Bartholomew is holding this skin, he's been skinned alive, or some people are holding
Mm-hmm.
spears from being speared, or swords from being sawn in half, or these sorts of things. And so there's this common perception that the apostles were willing to die for what they heard. But your book here, The Fate of the Apostles, is sort of the published version of your research work for your graduate degrees, postgraduate degrees. I'm really interested, what did you discover historically about the fate of the apostles and those so-called martyrdom stories?
Yeah, this is really a personal journey for me. I helped my dad update his book, Evidence Demands Verdict. Also helped update the book, More Than a Carpenter, in 2009, before I started my doctoral studies. And he had a little section there highlighting the typical traditions of how the apostles died. And when I updated that, I remember thinking, how do we really know? And I kid you not, Dan, it's actually really embarrassing to admit, but I think we had a footnote in there that said something like, see church history, which is the broadest footnote in the history of footnotes. But it left this impression like, how do we know this?
Mm.
Then there were other stories later. I was actually had my group of my students up on a trip to Berkeley, high school students, and we brought in some atheists to speak. And this guy denied the existence of Jesus. And one of my students goes, well, why would all the apostles die if he didn't exist? And this atheist friend of mine goes, give me evidence that any of them died as martyrs. And my students like turned and looked at me, and I sat there like, I don't know the answer to this. I got to find it out. And I just started a
Yeah.
PhD program. So it became my area of study for 3 years plus, published in the book that you showed. Bottom line is, I think of the 12 apostles, and then if we add James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul
Mhm.
as an apostle, I think we have very high historical evidence that at least 4 of them died as martyrs. I think that's James, the brother of John. I think that's Paul. I think that's James, the brother of Jesus, James, brother of Jesus, and Peter. And then there's 2 that are at least more plausible than not. You can make a case for, I think, Andrew and Thomas. The other 8, I don't know where tradition ends and history begins.
Yeah.
That's really what I think the historical record shows. Now, we don't have to show they all died as martyrs. I think this is a piece of a larger resurrection argument. It doesn't prove Christianity is true. It doesn't prove the resurrection is true. I think what this shows is rules out that they're liars. It helps rule out some conspiracy theory, and it shows their sincerity, that they at least really believed they had seen the risen Jesus and didn't invent a story and then put themselves intentionally in harm's way. So we can't show they all died as martyrs, but I think the early chapters in Acts, in some ways, are sufficient to show that they believed they had seen the risen Jesus, and they're willing to proclaim a crucified Messiah who's an enemy of the state of Rome, so to speak, who was crucified as an enemy, and they're willing to suffer for that. They're not inventing this story. Obviously, a ton more could be said, but I think the argument still works. We just have to nuance it and phrase it much more carefully.
Yeah, I completely agree. And if anyone wants to pick up that book, The Fate of the Apostles, or hear Sean on this, there's more interviews that you can pick up on YouTube. But the data is really important on that, and actually saying, all right, what are our
Mm,
historical sources? And we use this tagline here at Questioning Christianity, that truth invites questioning. And so one thing I've really
amen.
appreciated about watching you over the years has been where you come across these footnotes, see church history, you're like, you know what? I'm going to dig a little bit further into that just to be able to make sure that we've got some solid ground and give ground where ground needs to be given. You know what? That's a good argument. That's a good
Mm,
response. I don't really have an answer for that. So I appreciate that about you, mate. We always do a bit of a quick fire round with our guests where we just ask a little
okay.
bit of a way to get to know you a little bit, ask a series of questions with like sub 60-second answers. And I know it's hard, so you've got to try and limit yourself, but we'll kick this off. First question: what was your most powerful experience of God personally?
Oh, gosh. Probably one of my first experiences was reading the book Return of the Prodigal Son by Henry Nouwen in college. And he tells the story that he always thought he was the younger son of the prodigal son, realizing he was the older son. And when I read that story, I was like, oh my goodness, that's me. I'm the older son. I am self righteous, think I'm better than other people, and don't even realize how far I am away from the Lord. What
Mm,
I need is God's grace. And that was a very opening point for me to experience God's grace, you might say, and make it my faith real.
Yeah, that's a beautiful memory. Next question: what is your favorite argument for God or Christianity?
So if I had to pick one, I'd probably take the resurrection argument because you get everything in, so to speak, the identity of Jesus, the supernatural, the truth of Christianity, life after death. But I also think the argument from morality and beauty, which are kind of the same argument, are intriguing and powerful and so deeply intuitive that if I just had one argument to make, I'd probably make the argument from morality.
Yeah. What do you think is the most powerful argument against God or Christianity?
I think pretty obviously the problem of evil tied on to the hiddenness of God is the toughest to deal with because it raises logical questions, but also experiential and emotional questions. So I think the problem of evil and its various incarnations would be the toughest challenge.
Mm, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. What do you wish newcomers knew about Christianity?
Uh, I just wish that I want to make sure that newcomers actually understand the gospel because there's people new to Christianity that I'm not sure that are new to the church, new to the club, but many don't really understand the gospel. I had a young man I was speaking to one time, and I said, "Tell me that," who had said he left the faith. I said, "Tell me the experience you had of coming to faith." when you knew you were a sinner and you needed God's grace. And he's like, I came to Christianity, and he was a youth pastor, by the way, not because I was a sinner in need of redemption, but because I was hurting and told that Jesus would make me feel better.
Mm.
That's a false gospel. There's a lot of people, I think, in the church, in broader Christianity, that don't really understand God's grace.
What do you wish Christians would stop doing in conversations about God?
I think I wish we would stop speaking more, and we would listen more. Talk less, speak more. I wish we'd try to understand a view before we critique it.
Mm.
I wish we'd get a little bit less defensive when somebody sees the world differently than we do. Not feel like
Mm.
we have to answer every objection, but just lean in and try to understand first. I think in our culture today, to listen and understand in our busy, distracted, hurting cultures is one of the greatest acts of love. It also shows a deep confidence in what we believe too.
Mm. I love that. So appreciate that. And last one, if you could give 18-year-old Sean one piece of advice, what would it be?
Man, I've thought about this a lot. You know what? I don't even have any deep thing. It's funny. I don't have any deep advice that I would give myself. I wouldn't change where I'm at in life. And everything I've learned through mistakes. So maybe I'd just say, hey, you're going to make mistakes and you're going to blow it. That's okay. That's all a part of the journey. Just keep following Jesus, take it one day at a time, and things are going to work out.
Mm. I really appreciate that. It's a thoughtful and meaningful response to that one. Yeah, it's hard when I ask myself that one. I never know what to say. So I appreciate that. Hey, your newest book, Set Adrift, really picks up on the theme of deconstruction, which may be a new term to some of the people that are listening to this, may be eminently familiar to some others. This book's available everywhere now if people are curious after we kind of wander through some of the major pieces of the book to go and pick up their own copy. But we'd just love to hear from you. What sort of prompted your desire to write this book, and what were you hoping that would ultimately achieve?
It's really the book I wish existed 25 years ago. So I guess in some ways, to answer your question, it's the one book I would give to myself I wish I had available when not really 18. I guess I was probably 19 or 20 years old when I went through that questioning period. So there are really two vital things when I started to question my faith. We didn't use the term deconstruction. At that point, deconstruction meant, postmodern deconstruction, so to speak, in the
Mm.
90s. I think it means something very different today. But when I had questions about my faith, the first thing I need is people like J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig and Gary Habermas and other apologists to help me see that this was true. But then I had another friend in my life. He was kind of a spiritual guru, a spiritual mentor. His name was and is Rob Lone. And he just would ask me a lot of questions about my faith, about my journey, how I live with doubt, just kind of what it means to grow in my faith and own it. That huge wisdom that he poured into me. Sometimes I look at my life, Dan, and I know God is sovereign. I think if he wasn't there, I don't know what direction I would have gone. And that's true for my
Mm.
dad. That's true for a lot of people. And so this book is not giving apologetic answers. We start off by saying this isn't an apologetic book. We're trying to help people say, what does it mean to follow God when you have questions? How do we understand our underlying assumptions that we have? How do we really own our faith and move forward? It's like a spiritual guide through kind of a wasteland that somebody's going through, so to speak. Because I went through that season and it was difficult. So that's what this book is. The title is Deconstructing What You Believe Without Seeking Your Faith. So we're writing it for people who are saying, I want to follow Jesus. I want to follow the Bible, but I have a lot of questions that don't match up with the tradition of Christianity that's been passed on to me.
Mm.
What does it mean to follow Jesus? What boundaries are there in following Jesus today? What freedom do I have, so to speak?
Yeah.
That's really who this book is written for.
And can you describe kind of the driving metaphor? So that language of set adrift, I loved just in the opening chapter, sort of the example metaphor that you used. Do you want to explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I got to give my co-author John Marriott full credit for this, and the cover really captures it. Some books I love the cover, some less so. I really like the cover of this one, and the idea is somebody, and I'm sure you have this in in Australia, but we have this in the States. People like to go paddleboarding all the time.
Yeah,
And
I
we
do
say,
it at
imagine you
the
go out.
reservoir just up from us.
Oh, nice. Perfect. People do it all the time in the harbor, really close to where I live. You go out paddleboarding and a fog sets in, and all of a sudden you cannot tell what direction is in and what direction is further out. You feel unsettled and you don't know, in a sense, what to do. That's how many people in their faith happens in their faith. There's something that triggers this process of questioning, something that triggers a deconstruction period, and people feel set adrift, so to speak. So we're leaning in that to saying, okay, you find yourself feeling set adrift in your faith. What do you have to believe? How do you reorient your faith? How do you navigate this difficult season that you're in? That's what we're trying to do instead of drift, rather than coming in there saying, all right, here's exactly how you find your way back. Here's 4 steps to fix everything. That's not what we're doing. We're kind of coming along somebody within the season saying, here's the questions to ask. Here's maybe some dangers to avoid. And here's a helpful, biblically based path to follow Jesus amidst this season and questioning period you maybe find yourself going through.
Yeah, and it must be disorienting for people, particularly you described the mid-90s, for this new phenomenon of the internet. Well, it's well set, and this is generations now grown up entirely digitally exposed to social media
Yeah.
and all the different stories that are out there, scrolling through people's concerns, and so this phenomenon of deconstruction has really taken the limelight over the last 5 or 7 years. Key public Christians, a lot of them worship leaders or musicians or pastors, like Marty Sampson or Josh Harris or John Steingart, even Lecrae sort of talks about his experience of feeling set adrift and going through deconstruction, asking hard questions of his faith, although he did stay as a Christian. Do you have any sense of the numbers? How prevalent is this phenomenon of people going through this disorienting experience?
I think it's actually really hard to know in terms of numbers for a few reasons. Number one, we don't invite these kind of questions where people necessarily feel free to just express doubt, to ask questions in a church. We haven't created that culture as a whole. So oftentimes when people go through deconstruction and they end up deconverting, they'll say things like, I just didn't feel free to ask my questions. I felt I had to hide and bury this down. So for that reason, it's hard to really know how deep-seated questions people really have about the faith, interestingly enough. So that's one piece that I think makes it difficult. The second thing is, these stories that you tell, these are high-profile examples that get a lot of the press. So an earlier one was Tony Campolo, one of the biggest Christian evangelists, probably in the 90s and early 2000s, huge author, speaker, worked with Bill Clinton. His son was an evangelist, and he deconstructed and ultimately deconverted probably a decade or more ago. And, big publications did a whole story on this and paid attention to it. Well, they don't do a big story on me staying faithful to what my dad believes and following in his shoe steps and footsteps. And I'm not saying they should. This is not like a sore spot for me. My point is that that's a more intriguing narrative. Wow, he rejects his father's faith. And especially when our papers are more left-leaning anyways, they're going to tell that story. It's going to get the press. But for every pastor like that or evangelist, there's hundreds who are just plowing away, being faithful day by day, trying to follow Jesus and don't have that platform. So I think the numbers get exaggerated and they get told. So it's hard to put a gauge on it. And there's also a huge emphasis to tell your story and proclaim it to the world. That's the other element today. On social media, you got to come out and tell the world who you are and reveal your story. I mean, all these things just create this environment where in some ways we maybe feel like it's bigger than it is. But on the flip side, let's be honest, there's a lot of data about the nones, those who don't identify as religion, growing more and more in our culture. Now, those aren't necessarily people who have left the Christian faith. We just have a culture that is less identifying across generations as religious and as Christians. But that is just to say, we certainly see a secularizing phenomena and less people identifying as Christians, at least in my country, and I understand in the West. Really, since the 90s, according to Ryan Burge, you see this trend start to kick in.
Mm. And just on then the nature of deconstruction, I mean, there's different thoughts on this within the Christian world, certainly within the evangelical world. Someone like Alyssa Childers, for instance, is a lot more suspicious that deconstruction as a word or as a experience or phenomenal process can be redeemable, because it seems to set the person themselves going through the experience as a supreme authority over scripture, and it maybe inevitably leads away from faith.
Mhm.
I'm curious, how do you define deconstruction, and do you think it can be framed somewhat positively in that way?
Yeah, so I recently interviewed Elisa and Tim on their book, The Deconstruction of Christianity, that comes out the end of January. And the bottom line is 95% plus of things we agree on. Really, the only difference, which is not insignificant, is whether or not we should, quote, redeem or use the word deconstruction to describe a questioning process. And one of the things Elisa said is if you look outside of kind of evangelicals, most people are using it as a way of shedding their Christian faith. And there's a larger community. There's conferences, there's books, there's whole TikTokers committed to helping you deconstruct your faith in the sense of abandoning it. As
Mm,
far as Christians, she said to me, which was interesting, she said, I actually think, Sean, you who use it positively are in more of the majority amongst more conservative Christians tend to use it. And you see people like Michael Kruger, Trevin Wax in his series. You mentioned Lecrae earlier. We do so in our book, frame it more positively. To me, the issue is it's less the word that we use and more the heart and the process we're going through. The
mm,
word doesn't mean a ton to me, and I don't think it has as much power as some people would attribute to it. So I'm concerned in somebody's heart state. And then as long as we define the word very carefully, here's what we mean by it, here's different ways that it is used. Words are on the move. Words often have a range of meanings. And so it really doesn't bother me to use it that way. In fact, I kind of tend to see it's a positive thing that people are saying, okay, wait, there's a way to deconstruct that's positive, not the negative way we're seeing other
mm,
people do it critically outside of the faith. So that's where
mm.
the debate is. And we had a really good, healthy, extended conversation with this, Elisa, Tim, and I. And I said, I don't want to debate this. Let's just clarify where we stand, kind of clarify for folks what's at stake, and then let people decide what they think is most reasonable.
Yeah, well, we'll make sure there'll be a link to your YouTube channel as well in the show notes for this when it goes up, so people can jump across and find that conversation on there. So this experience, then, someone has a whole lot of questions about the faith in which they were raised. There's still something to
Mhm.
the God thing. There's still something to the Jesus thing. They know there's something there in terms of an anchor point, but they're feeling entirely uncertain around a whole range of beliefs. And particularly, maybe one of the concerns is sort of sources of authority. Can I trust the traditions or the beliefs that have been handed down to me? Where do I look then for answers, or am I maybe just being fed more things from sources that are untrustworthy? And so that sort of uncertainty about where do I look, kind of beautifully captured in your metaphor as well. What do you think are some of the major causes then of deconstruction? What's prompting this feeling of being set adrift?
Well, first off, I completely agree that it's a question of authority. That's what it rests down to. It's not like those who are evangelicals have an authority and those who are outside of the faith don't. We all have some authority that we look to. It might be science as being supreme, it might be the self, it might be culture, it might be scripture. The question is not if we have an authority, the question is what is our authority and why?
Yeah.
So that's really what the root of the question is. And so when I've had, like you mentioned, progressive Christians on my YouTube channel to have conversations, I think it comes down to we treat the Bible as a very different means of authority.
Yeah.
So is it like a wax nose that I can kind of twist and adapt and change to some version that I think is loving, or based on culture or my feelings or some other standard? Or am I to conform myself to the Bible even if I don't understand it and I don't like it? Does it carry an inherent sense of authority within itself? That's really the root of the question. I think a lot of this LGBTQ conversation is really about, is the Bible inspired and the Word of God? And does it inform us about reality? So, authority and epistemology really is where a lot of the debate is today. With that
Mm,
said, I think I've come more and more to like the term when it comes to deconstruction triggers that people have. There's often something that just triggers and causes a kind of questioning period to occur. And that could be like me coming across really smart people who saw the world differently. You get unsettled intellectually,
Mm,
many times from people who have deconstructed to the point of deconversion. If I listen long enough, I find a lot of church hurt that's there. I see a lot of people are triggered by hypocrisy, so to speak. I think there's a number of people like Bart Campola would say straight up, and he was before it was even called deconstruction. He would say things like, my friend, I met people who were gay and they were really kind, and I just couldn't believe that their relationship was sinful. So I started to question the authority of the Bible because of a human relationship that they have. And he also described a real instance of evil that he saw, and that started to make him wonder, how can God be good and powerful when I
mm,
see such evil? So it's important when talking with somebody who is going through a deconstruction. The first question is, what do you mean by deconstruction? Right? I've had people say to me just this week, someone called me and said, Sean, I'm deconstructing my faith. I said, before you go any further, what does that mean? And they'll
mm,
say either I'm losing my faith, or they'll say I'm still following Jesus, but I'm rethinking some stuff and it's unsettling. So step
mm,
number one, what do you mean by deconstruction? And then step number two, I just want to listen and get to the root of, okay, when did this start? What triggered it? What was the cause of this? And it could be intellectual, it could be emotional, it could be moral many times, it could be experiential, it could be some combination of all of those. So we have to be careful to really try to listen to people and understand their story and their journeys. But there's a lot of things that can really trigger somebody going through that kind of period.
mm. Well, I'm keen to lean into some of those triggers and maybe see how you might
Sure.
respond to a few of them in a minute, because I know there are a lot of newcomers that are exploring Christianity, or maybe skeptics or apatheists who are kind of convinced there's nothing really to it because of the kind of pitfall questions that you sort of raised before. Before we get there, what might be some encouragements and pitfalls for those who do feel like, Sean, I am deconstructing? What would you encourage them with?
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is, what do they mean by deconstruction? And I might
Hmm.
encourage somebody differently who's saying, I'm losing my faith, versus the call I got this week from somebody who said, I'm still following Jesus, but I'm rethinking a lot of things I learned. And so my encouragement is going to vary based on that. But
Yeah.
the first thing I would do is I'd probably say, hey, thanks for calling. The first step, or talking to me, the first step is just to express this, get it off your chest. So I'm happy to listen and spend the time understanding and trying to hear where you're coming from. Second, I would say you're not the first person who's done this. It feels new to you. It feels unsettling. I've been through this, and there's a ton of other people who have. So you're
Mm,
not alone, and there's helpful resources if you're willing to really stick with this and get to the root of what's going on for you. So I guess I
mm,
want the person to know that they're not alone. There's other people who will go through this journey with them. I also want people to know that doubt is not the opposite of faith. Sometimes people think if they're having questions, that means they don't believe anymore. Doubt's not the opposite of faith. Unbelief is the opposite of faith. You
mm,
can doubt and believe, which is why Jude 122 says, have mercy on those who doubt.
mm. It's a beautiful line, isn't it? Just that encouragement from the
Love
Lord's
it.
brother. There's we did a short video actually on how to deconstruct your faith. And we're just trying to come up with a few things that may be
Mm,
helpful for people who are feeling that. And one of them was even just, what is your end game? Because I think asking that
great.
question helps people process. Look, do I want to ultimately deconstruct for the sake of renovation, or do I want to end up with a pile of rubble? Is this a destructive process that I'm looking for as a way out, or do I want to be able to emerge out the other
Mm,
side with something real and something I can genuinely live in as a way of making sense of the world? Some of those meaningful questions are kind of there, and I love that idea of just finding safe people you can journey with, people that are wise, people that know how to ask the good questions without forcing their own things upon you, but can help become a bit of a guide through meaningful resources to search for a solid foundation. I know there are tons of parents as well that ask me questions
Hey,
in
can
this
I
area,
can I
you
ask
know?
you something? But
Yeah.
before we shift to parents, a friend of mine, Matt Anderson, has a book called "Called into Questions," And at the end of it, he has a chapter he wrote when he updated the book for those who are deconstructing. And he just asks them certain questions. It's such a good essay at the end of this book. So he says things like, there's a certain deconstruction community online that is very critical and anti-Christian. He says, is this a healthy community to be a part of when you have questions? That's a very fair question.
Yeah.
He says, here's another question. Do you really understand the faith that you are reacting against and rejecting? And the initial instinct is, of course I do. But Dan, the more I probe people who have left the faith, the more confident I am to say that most people I've met who left the faith were never really in it in the first place. They
Mm.
weren't. Now, I can't judge anybody's heart. I'm not going to. But if somebody's deconstructed, I'm saying be careful who you put around yourself of the community. But second, have you really taken the time to understand the community that you are rejecting? Be sure you're not rejecting a straw man. And the way you said that, what is your end game, is huge. My co-author, he said, think about the way when you cut a log, the angle you go in really determines the cut of the log and the angle it goes out. So as you're angling into this, what really is your heart? What is your desire? Where do you want to end up? Just
Mm.
being aware of where your heart is huge. So I love that you asked that question, by the way.
Yeah, really helpful insights, mate. And I will get a link to that chapter as well so that people can follow that up. It sounds like a great series of questions to ask. Yeah, so on this notion, a lot of parents often ask me, looking at the stats of people who have grown up within Christianity, within the church, there's a large number of teenagers who, at least for a time, maybe through their college years or sort of 17 through to 25, seem to wander away from their Christian faith. What advice would you give to parents who are hoping to raise their kids with a grounded sort of Christian faith in God and Jesus, in the truth of the gospel?
Well, I've been studying the data on this for a long time, and I think there's no formula for this, but if there were, this is what the data would show. If you want to pass on your faith, number one, you have to model a faith that's compelling to your kids. Not perfect, but if you're not living a life of following Jesus, your kids aren't going to find it compelling, and it's
Mm.
not going to matter what you say. So the first step is to look in the mirror and just say, am I really following Jesus? Do I love the Lord? That's step number one. Step number two, build a relationship with your kids. Build a close, intimate relationship with your kids. And it's not just about quality over quantity, it's both. You need
Mm.
quantity and you need special memories that you build that are qualitative. Build an intimate, close relationship with your kids. By the way, the largest faith transmission study I'm aware of, out of a professor named Vern Bankston from University of Southern California, 35 years, 3,500 people, 4 generations. What they found, they published it with Oxford University Press, by the way. The number one factor in faith transmission was, quote, a warm relationship with the Father.
Hmm.
Number one,
Wow.
statistically speaking. Doesn't make the mother unimportant. The father tends to be more of a wild card. That's just what stood out statistically. So model your faith. 2, build a warm, intimate, close relationship with your kids. And number 3, have meaningful spiritual conversations with your kids throughout the rhythm of life. This is the Shema
Mm.
and Deuteronomy 6:4. Talk
Yeah.
faith when they wake up, walk along the road, when they lie down, etc. So model, build a relationship with your kids, and look for times to have spiritual conversation. Let me give one example what this looks like.
Yeah, that'd be
When we're
helpful.
done here, I'm taking my son to a basketball game, and my son, he's 19 years old. When he was 14, he wanted to see this movie that came out called Bohemian Rhapsody about the rock band Queen. It was PG-13, so I had a little bit of concerns, but I'm like, he's 14, he's old enough. I said, buddy, I'll take you to see this. If when we're done, you just talk with me about it. I want to know what you see and what you think and how you feel
Mhm.
about the movie. He goes, sure, Dad. So we go to the movie, we come back, brought one of his friends, and we go and we sit down at the dinner table, which is, 20 feet back to my right. And we sit down and I just go, hey, buddy, what'd you think? What was your favorite scene? Did you enjoy the movie? Is this what you expected the movie to be like? I said, hey, as Christians, are there any things we can agree with in this film? Then I said, are there any things that gave you pause? Any things that you thought were contrary to the Christian faith? Did you ever feel like you were being preached at? And just in conversation for probably 20 or 30 minutes, we discussed the film from a Christian standpoint. Those three things, Dan, as a whole, and by the way, there's no guarantee. Kids aren't bricks that you can just, put plaster on and put them into
Totally.
a wall. We have this stubborn thing called free will. I think the data shows if we want to pass on our faith, build a relationship with our kids, model that faith, and engage them in spiritual conversation.
Mhm. Mate, I love that. Thanks for that sort of insight as well for the parents that are watching in. There's a lot of more resources. We might put a couple more links in the show notes as well, just for them to get their head around that. But you've been a really helpful model with that. Can we dive into then just a few of these deconstruction barriers, these
Sure.
triggers that people often have? And imagine just trying to do 2 or 3 before we close out the episode. One of the most common ones you mentioned already is this experience of church hurt, or maybe more broadly, becoming really disillusioned in the church tradition in which you were raised. And people would be familiar. There's a whole range of different denominational experiences, and the country that you live in and the part of that country often shapes what that denomination looks like in a big way as well. But I think this picked up big over COVID as people maybe stepped back from engagement with the local church community and began to ask some critical questions around, is this healthy? Is this actually helping me become more like Jesus? So whether it's people who have genuinely experienced religious trauma of a kind or some kind of spiritual abuse, all the way through to there's just a lot of hypocritical leaders that are getting exposed as having a very dark double life, or the church just doesn't really seem to be all that much about Jesus. There's just a big question mark over a church that doesn't seem to live up to the legacy of the Lord Jesus in that way. What would be your response to people that are raising this as a concern or maybe barrier to believing in Jesus?
Well, the first thing I would say is I am sorry if somebody's experienced church hurt. Like the one place you're supposed to go to be loved and cared for and treated safely, you're not. So the hurt and the pain and the anger is
Mm,
completely natural. It's completely normal. And my heart breaks for you. I've spent a good amount of time studying spiritual abuse and church hurt, and it's heartbreaking how much this happens. So,
mm,
I'm sorry. I wish I could fix it and I could change that for you. Obviously, I can't. One thing I would say is, if hypocrisy in the church is something that bothers you, I would graciously push back and I would say, is this because the church is living out what Jesus taught, or is the church failing to live out what Jesus taught? And I think the answer is really clear. The church hurt and church abuse is when people are failing for whatever reason to live out and model the teachings of Jesus.
mm,
So lean into that person of Jesus, see exactly who it is. And really, the ultimate question is Christianity true? If so, we got to follow it. That's the root of the question. So, one of the positive things is you're right. We've seen a lot of stories come forward, whether it's Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, how terrible that is. So many different leaders in churches. I think for those stories we hear, there's dozens that are not acting that way that don't get the press,
mm,
but those painful stories are very real. But the other positive is there's a lot more people talking about spiritual abuse. There's a lot more people talking about church abuse and using platforms that they didn't have in the past. And I've done this on my own to draw attention to it. I think of Michael Kruger's recent book on spiritual abuse is just fantastic and it's powerful. And it really
mm,
shows that what spiritual abuse is it's one thing, not just one thing, I'm not downplaying it, but it's terrible to take advantage of somebody when there's a power dynamic. But when that power dynamic is speaking for God, it's hard for somebody who's subservient to separate that person who's claiming to speak for God from who God really is.
mm,
That's what makes spiritual abuse so damaging to somebody. And he's speaking out about it and drawing attention to it. And so
mm,
there's a positive for that amidst the stories that you're talking about. There are some communities online, there's people who speak about this. I would just say to the person, I would say again, I'm sorry what you went through. Take it step by step. Don't let anybody tell you, got to get in church next week. Like, take it step by step, get healing and people around you that can help address that. But
mm,
hopefully, you can get to a point where you won't allow the pain that happened to you, which is an abuse of what Jesus taught and an abuse of what the church is for, to not experience the good of who Jesus is and what a loving church is really, really like and what it's
Mm.
meant to be.
Mm. That's really helpful. I always love that idea that Jesus is not done with the church. And
Mm,
nearly every letter in the New Testament exists because the beliefs or often behaviors of the early church communities did not match up to the Lord Jesus himself. And so if God exposes that publicly in order to bring about reform, and that's still something that God's doing today.
mm,
There's a lot of people as well that maybe grew up, and I particularly noticed this in Marty Sampson when he put out that Instagram story, which is this real heart cry from him in this process of sort of deconstruction, saying, "Hey, I've kind of grown up within Christianity and kind of just assumed this was true the whole way, but I've got a range of questions. And am I just a Christian because I was born into this particular subculture? You know, you often hear the atheist critique of if you were born in India, you'd be a Hindu. If you're born in Saudi Arabia, you'd be a
sure.
Muslim. Skip over the notion if you were born in Oxford, then you'd probably be a secular person. But
Right.
I do think a lot of Christians have that feeling that, you know, am I just a Christian because I was raised in this environment? And that sparks how do I know that this is real? How do I know this is true? How might you respond to someone who's just exploring this truth question for the first time?
Well, that's actually a very understandable objection. I remember feeling that even in the 90s, that question period I was talking about, going, am I just a Christian because my parents are? And I live in this context. What about all these other countries? So it's not just the atheists. I think it's a very fair question to lean into. It's a very human, natural question. I would just say there are people with equal confidence across various worldviews. How do we know one is true and the other's not? That's where all we can do is look at the evidence. We have to. What's the evidence Islam is true? And do a heart check and ask myself, if it were really true, would I follow it? Would I have the
Mm,
courage and conviction to do so? And all
mm,
I can do is speak for myself, Dan, and say if Islam was true, I would have to believe it. There's way too much at stake, eternal life. I mean, you and I are flat out heretics because we believe Jesus is God. We've committed one of the worst sins according to Islam. So we better get it right.
mm,
I just don't think the evidence is there. And
mm,
especially according to the Islamic belief that Jesus didn't die on the cross. I mean, that just disqualifies it from me from really possibly being true. Well, we've
mm,
got to look at the evidence for different faiths and ask, where does the evidence point? Which is actually true? And do I have the willingness and the courage to follow it? And what's unique about it in Christianity is it really invites an investigation. Jesus did
mm,
public miracles. When the apostles are preaching in Acts chapter 2 at Pentecost, Peter's like, Jesus did these things in public. And you yourselves know that he died on the cross and was buried and has appeared to people. They are proclaiming this message publicly, pointing towards the evidence itself.
mm,
And so I guess in some, I'd want to say that's an understandable question and should make all of us pause. If we just believe everything our family and our parents and our culture believes, chances are we got something wrong. But when it comes to
mm,
faith issues, let's look at the evidence itself, see where it points. And the other thing I would say is, I would say, why has Jesus turned the world upside down, the West and the East, more than any other religious figure? What is it about Jesus that everybody wants a piece of Jesus? Muslims want a piece of Jesus. New Agers want a piece of Jesus. Many atheists like some of the teachings of Jesus. Buddhists want a piece of Jesus. Hindus do. Who is this person, Jesus, and why has he turned the world upside down more than anybody else?
mm.
That question is vital to get an answer to.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you've got real questions on that, the fate of the apostles, get you started. But certainly, new evidence that demands a verdict covers a lot of that kind of ground as well, in terms of exploring the uniqueness of Jesus and why you can trust the kind of claims of the eyewitnesses. There's a lot of concerns around sort of the ethical implications of Christianity today. You know, that shift from how
Mm,
do we know Christianity is true to even if this were true, is this good or is this net negative for society, and particularly whether it's the ethical stories in the Bible and concerns around Old Testament passages. But one of the big ones for a lot of my secular friends comes down to the Bible's sexual ethics, that it's either seen to single out sexual minorities, or it's just seen more generally to be repressive or harmful towards people's sexual wholeness or wholeness in terms of pursuing their own identity. How would you respond to that kind of broad concern around the Bible's sexual ethics?
Well, I'd say a few things. First off, the idea of loving our neighbor and caring for people who see the world differently is a Christian ethic. I mean, Jesus tells this story, of course, in the Gospel of Luke about the Good Samaritan. So, this idea of loving our enemies, loving our neighbors, is a deeply Christian idea. Second, the idea that everybody, white, black, rich, poor, doesn't matter where you're from, your level of IQ, male, female, your sexual orientation, has intrinsic value and inherent worth because they're made in the image of God. Again, that's a uniquely Christian, Judeo Christian virtue. Now, with that said, as a Christian, I do find myself committed to the person of Jesus and the sexual ethic that Jesus taught. And Jesus taught that marriage is to be one man and one woman in a committed relationship for life. Now, Jesus was single, so he shows the goodness and beauty of singleness, but he also had a definition of marriage. And a question I would want to ask is, how would society actually be if people lived out the sexual ethic of Jesus? That's a really interesting question. If people are married to their spouse and only had sex with their spouse, the opposite sex, or somebody's single, they weren't sexually active, how would that affect society and culture as a whole? I think it's pretty obvious that number one, there'd be less abortions, there'd be less STDs, there'd be less divorce. All of these objective metrics would, in fact, go down, and people would flourish because they'd have a mom and a dad to care for them, as Jesus taught. Now, I realize that didn't directly answer the question that you're looking at. What about the claim that Christian teachings cause harm? I would say I'd like to see the evidence for this. And I'm not convinced by it. Now, there's Christians who have said harmful things. There's Christians who have treated people who are gay in an un-Christian-like fashion. But the claim that Christian teachings itself causes harm has been argued for. It's been used to shame and silence people on many occasions. There's some narratives people use to back it up, but the objective data is not there that the teaching itself causes that harm. I don't think the evidence is there. So I would push back and I would say, where in fact is the evidence to support such a serious claim that's often thrown around today, sometimes somewhat haphazardly?
Mm. Yeah, and I think one of the key challenges is just trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And a lot of my concern is, when Christians respond to this, is if someone doesn't believe that God created us and that he imbues sex and marriage with a particular purpose, then I get why they may come out with a different sexual ethic. But to invite them back to jump into your shoes, if God did create the world, if sex and marriage do exist to point to something beyond themselves, then not only do sexual ethics serve to guard us from the kind of harms that you talk about and maybe promote certain kind of flourishing, but they're also fulfilling a particular purpose. And I don't expect you to agree with that until you necessarily come to the point of realizing, no, God is there, he does care, and that he has designed these things for particular reasons. So like you said, just being able to listen and step outside of your own worldview to invite someone else to consider differently, I think is a really useful skill. Just one word then, just before we close out. You mentioned before, you think the biggest problem for Christianity and for the case for God is the problem of evil and attached to it, divine hiddenness. Now, this is a monster question. We've tackled it in a series of interviews and small videos on our channel before with different figures who've written on this substantively. But what would be your 1 minute go-to when someone says, look, I just can't believe in God because of all the bad things in the world? What do you want to land on with that person as to why you think the Christian story really does have something to offer?
Well, if I had 1 minute, I would just say, tell me your story. Why, of all the questions you can ask about God, do you ask that question? and help me understand why you think the idea of God existing and God being good is incompatible with the existence of evil. And I'm going to
Mm,
ask a lot of questions because when we talk about evil, for most people, it's more personal and it's existential than it is philosophical and logical. They've
mm,
been hurt. They see hurt. They see the chaos in the world and it's personal to them. The way we respond to somebody who's personally experienced evil and suffering is very different than how we respond logically. So, in 1 minute, I would just say, "Guy, tell me why you asked that question of all questions. When did it first
mm,
trouble you? And help me understand why you think the idea of evil is incompatible with there being a loving God." And
mm.
then, because evil, by its very definition, you cannot give a 1 minute response, I would lean in to understand, lean in to show empathy, show I'm not
Mm.
afraid of their question, and probably invite them into a larger conversation.
Yeah, love that, mate. Hey, well, Sean, it's so appreciate your time coming on. I know you've got a big influence globally, but I'm just so thankful for your voice in kind of the God conversation and all the influence that your both thinking and writing and research and teaching has kind of had over the years, particularly now in this area of doubt and deconstruction for those conversations that
Mm.
you've hosted online, differences amongst Christians, and then helping to really build bridges with people who have wrestling with faith or maybe have even left faith. It's just been a great example. Where can people go to be able to find your podcast and books and YouTube channel, stick more with your work?
Well, probably the hub for everything is just my website, but I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, have a YouTube channel, have books. Where else am I actually gonna have a TikTok account where I post TikToks? But the hub to those different worlds, probably the website, SeanMcDowell.org, links to those. So
Great.
that's probably the best place to start.
Great. Well, we'll make sure, again, we put that in the show notes below. Do you have a parting message to anyone who might be considering Christianity?
Oh my goodness. I would just say read the Gospel of John. That's one of the most influential, interesting books that has shaped culture, the history of the world. And just ask yourself a simple question: who is this person, Jesus? And why has the story of Jesus turned the world and governments and families and individuals upside down more than anybody who's ever lived? That'd
Mm.
be my encouragement to start with the Gospel of John.
Well, thanks so much, Sean, for jumping on. We hope certainly one day to be able to get you all the way over onto Aussie shores. Maybe you can
Mm.
shift then from tackling big questions to wrestling some wild Aussie animals. So thanks for coming on the channel.
Thanks, Dan. I'd love it.
It's a big deal to make it to the end of the episode, so a huge thanks to everyone who watches the channel. If you're brand new here, please do go ahead and subscribe, and as always, comment and like, help get the algorithm out there to everyone else. If you have any other questions, you can check out our website at questioningchristianity.com and submit them. We're creating video content every single week, and otherwise jump over to our socials at QC Socials on Facebook, Instagram, and on TikTok. Thanks so much for joining, and until next time, truth invites questioning. See ya.